Hello, my name is Richard Gregory. I'm professor of finance at East Tennessee State University, and I'm here to talk to you today about E, the measure of environmental sustainability or environmental risk management. E is a measure of either of these things used by investors and people throughout the world and provided by hundreds of risk management agencies. This is a departure from what we usually do in that this is a broad overview of many of the issues in measuring environmental risk and environmental sustainability. So we're going to look at what is E, measuring the environmental pillar of sustainability. Now, E, by most people's definition, is intended as a measure of environmental sustainability, however that is defined. How well a company or a nation is meeting goals that contribute to environmental sustainability, such as the United Nations-backed principles for responsible investment. The reality, though, of the measurement of Z is, well, let's take a look at a representative sample from 4 leading companies out of the hundreds that provide E-scores. First of all, we'll look at from the Financial Times Stock Exchange Russell, FTSE, as it's abbreviated. They purport to measure the quality of a company's respective management of ESG issues, or exposure, measure of the relevance for a company of respective ESG issues. And this comes from their methodology document, their most recent issue of 2019. Morgan Stanley Capital Investments, their measures the negative externalities that a company in an industry generates, which issues may turn into unanticipated costs for the companies in the medium to the long term. Conversely, which ESG issues affect an industry that may turn into opportunities for companies in the medium into the long term. And this again comes from their most recent methodology document from December 2020. A third rater, Refinitiv, they say their ESG scores are designed to transparently and objectively measure a company's relative ESG performance, commitment, and effectiveness based on company-reported data. Objectively, that's a big word. And then there's Sustainalytics, a company that's been around for a long time providing ESG ratings. They say they are designed to help investors identify and understand financially material ESG risk at the security and portfolio level and how they might affect the long-term performance for equity and fixed income investments. So you should notice that what these ratings measure environmentally is very different from what investors and consumers want companies to measure. There have been numerous surveys of what investors and consumers want from ratings. They want ratings that tell them what companies are doing good environmentally. But ratings firms are providing ratings that try to measure the risk environmental issues to firms. Thus, we have a great disconnect between what rating firms are providing in terms of measuring E and what investors and consumers want. So there's a bit of a disconnect. Now, in terms of research, many people argue, well, this measure of risk can be used as a proxy of environmental sustainability. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Now, what factors go into measuring E? What factors are counted in the E pillar? Well, they differ dramatically by the ratings firm. If we put up all 100 firms, we would find 100 different definitions of E. For example, FTSE Russell doesn't go into any great detail about what is included in E. They just say they measure biodiversity, using 25 different items. They measure climate change using 49 different items. Pollution and resources using 23 items. The supply chain, however that's defined, by 24 different items, and water security by 27 different items. I imagine somewhere in there there's some sort of measure of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, wherever that is included, I'm not exactly sure, and probably waste generated, probably in pollution and resources. Morgan Stanley Capital and International goes into even less detail. They just say climate change is measured, natural capital, however that's defined, pollution and waste, I'm guessing that's similar to pollution and resources, and environmental opportunities, which they define as when a company takes advantage of new products that arise through environmental resources, such things like pollution abatement, etc. Refinitiv has three areas that they measure environmental factors on: emissions, innovations, and resource use, and doesn't tell any more details. Sustainalytics refers to factors that are used to inform the assessments, including the company's events track record, structured internal data such as CO2 emissions, company reporting, and third-party research, and doesn't tell us any more details. So there you have it. These are the factors that go in. As you can tell, these are not very definite and very vague. And as you can tell, there are probably a lot of differences in what goes in to measuring E between just these four companies. So that the E between these four companies are probably not strictly comparable. All providers, all 100 plus providers of E ratings, use a combination of company self-reported data, publicly published information, government information, academic information, and non-governmental organization data sets. Some providers also send companies custom questionnaires asking them to fill them out. And that's where they get their data from. As you can tell, most of the data relies heavily on company self-reporting. We'll get to that in a moment. Each company has a custom methodology for combining this information to come up with a solid solo E score. The exact methodology of scoring is not detailed enough for replication for any of these companies' ratings. And in fact, we're told pretty vaguely about how the methodology is accomplished. For FTSE Russell, we're told that the scoring is done by level of exposure, however that's defined, and then scores are weighted by the themes, which we talked about earlier, such as biodiversity and so forth. We're not told what the weights are. MSCI, Morgan Stanley Capital International, says that by each industry, scores are weighted by issue. I assume the issues are the things like pollution and resources, and that the weightings take into account both the contribution of the industry, and Morgan Stanley Capital defines industry differently from everybody else, relative to all other industries, to the negative or positive impact on the environment, and the timeline within which we expect that risk or opportunity for companies in the industry to materialize. They don't tell you how they measure that. I'm not sure how you would measure that. Refinitiv calculates environmental and social category scores, as well as the controversy scores. The TRBC industry group is used as the benchmark, so they have their own custom industry group. And then a weighted average is used. They don't define the weights again and do not release the weights. Sustainalytics uses regression analysis. Regressing, it is implied, each item on some dependent variable. We're not told what the dependent variable is, and then uses a weighted average of regression betas from the factors. We're not told what the weighted average is. As you can imagine, there are a lot of issues with E that are not reported in the methodologies. The first is the validity and reliability of self-reported data. How valid and reliable are the self-reported data of companies? We don't know. Now, in some cases, for pollution data and waste data, we do have government agencies that also issue reports on how much CO2 and waste is emitted. But in some categories, we just do not have any tracking that is independent. Plus, the use of government agencies to validate the tracking of CO2 emissions and waste management emissions ignores the problem of regulatory capture, where the government department might be subject to pressure from the companies to alter reports or give favorable reviews. There is no literature on the validity or reliability of the self-reported data of companies on e-reporting. E-data is subject to retroactive changes. Berg et al. Have documented enormous retroactive changes in the Refinitiv ESG scores from 2011 to 2017, extensive changes that have altered the ESG scores for numerous companies. So that it would change the outcomes of numerous studies based on using the E-scores from this era, from Refinitiv. As you can imagine, there is lack of agreement and convergence between the E-scores from different firms. Chatterjee et al. In 2016 found that the ESG scores had a positive correlation between 13 and 52%. Berg et al. In 2020, the most recent study, found between 38 and 70%. If you enlarge the universe to all 100 issuers of ratings, I'm sure that these correlations would be even lower. In both of these cases, the sample was relatively small, only about 6 or 7 raters. Ratings are also plagued by inconsistency. Numerous authors have noted the sheer variety and inconsistency of the data and measures and how companies reported them, as we have just noted, just looking at 4 of them. Just the wide variety of how E is defined and measured. There is tremendous inconsistency between the raters. I'm sure that all of them probably use CO2 emissions and hazardous waste issued, but how they're combined and how they're measured and scored differs tremendously. Benchmarking is another E issue. How data providers define companies' peer groups, as we have seen, can be crucial in determining the performance ranking of a company. How peer groups defined varies tremendously between raters. Some raters use the old standard industrial codes classifications, the SIC codes, to group companies. Some use the relatively new North American industrial codes, the NAICS. Some use their own in-house definitions of industries, such as Morgan Stanley or Bloomberg. They are users who have their own definitions of industries. So you just don't know what you're getting when you're looking at industry groupings and different, so you just don't know what you're looking at when you're looking at those industry groupings. And thus, benchmarking can give you very different results. Then there is the unspoken problem of missing data. Many firms have missing data that they don't disclose. There are a number of reasons for this. Some firms just don't report environmental data. Some firms don't have the data. Some are lackadaisical in reporting the data, particularly in the international environment. And in some cases, they report different data than other firms. There is no uniform reporting standards for environmental sustainability data. Let's take an example from a ratings firm from 2018 that I got their environmental data that went into their ratings for Apple Incorporated in 2018. Here we see their ratings. I have disguised their ratings, so these are no longer the ratings they actually issued. These are disguised numbers now, so you can't figure out who the rater is. And here is the total greenhouse gases that were issued by Apple during 2010 to 2018. Now, here is all supposed to be direct CO2, total CO2, and potential CO2. These are all supposed to be included in the score. Nitrous oxide emissions were supposed to be included in the score. Then we have total energy used, total water used, hazardous emissions, total waste, and then here environmental fines, and then environmental fines dollars. You'll notice that a lot of this data is missing from 2000 to 2018. So in order to get these scores, what did they do? All of these items were supposed to be filled. How did they get these scores? You may be asking, if all of these items were supposed to be filled in order to get the score. Well, they imputed. That is, they used regression analysis from other data about Apple and imputed those numbers. Now, what is really odd about this is that the missing CO2 data is perplexing, as Apple had issued an environmental progress report each year since 2011 that detailed CO2 emissions. See apple.com environment /. What's also odd is that publicly available information, the missing fines data, is also perplexing in that Apple incurred environmental fines in 2017 in North Carolina. That was part of publicly available information. And in 2016 in California, that was part of publicly available information. That was not included in this data set. That was available as of 2018. And this is not unusual for data sets. Keep in mind, there are tens of thousands of companies throughout the world that we're providing data for. And, putting in data information is not a high priority job. High priority jobs are typically analyst jobs and sales jobs, not data entry. So the missing data is imputed oftentimes. How is it imputed? We're not told. We're not told how it's imputed. I have my suspicions. I assume that some of the data is imputed using other data from the firm, and I have had that confirmed unofficially by people in the industry, that it's often imputed using comparison with data from firms that are in similar industries who they have complete data for. And that sometimes it's imputed using financial data that has a stable relationship, stable in quotations, with things like CO2 emissions and waste, etc., usually size of the firm. And that's how they deal with it. Another E issue is that E is related to firm size. In a recent paper, Drempedic et al. Found a significant positive correlation between a firm's ESG rating, and E rating, by the way, and the firm's size. That is, as firm size goes up, the better E rating you get. So the bigger firms get better E ratings on average than smaller firms. Another problem with E is that if E is a measure of environmental risk, it may be measuring the wrong thing. Balvers et al. And myself found that when it comes to environmental exposure, a big thing that is being ignored is temperature shocks. We found that regional temperature shocks and world temperature shocks, that is, temperatures going up suddenly, have an enormous effect on stock returns. That can't be explained by other factors. And these are not being accounted for in these scores, these E scores. And plus, also, Gregory in 2021 found that climatic disasters also have an enormous effect on stock returns that is being neglected. Though S&P has now come out with their climatic risk scores that attempts to address some of that. There is some good news, though, about E-scores. Now, I've been very critical of E-scores. Now, let's step back and keep in mind what these companies are trying to do. They're trying to take a lot of information about the environmental practices of firms and compress it into one data point. A very difficult task. The good news is that Fried et al. In 2015, in a review of more than 2,000 studies, finds that roughly 90% of studies have found a non-negative relation between ESG scores and corporate financial performance. It's a relatively weak relationship, but it does seem to be there. So there does seem to be a relationship that is positive between ESG scores and corporate financial performance, though the relationship seems to be weaker for the E score than for the S&G scores. And Chatterjee in 2009 found that environmental ratings, I don't know why I said economic, to be fairly good summaries of past environmental performance, and in additions, that firms with lower environmental ratings have slightly but statistically significant more pollution and regulatory compliance violations in later years. So these E ratings are picking up something useful in terms of environmental sustainability. There are only a few case studies about E that I think are of any use right out now. One's put out by the CFA Institute, Guidance and Case Studies for ESG Integration, Equities and Fixed Income. you might find of some interest, and then case studies of environmental risk analysis methodologies, network for greening the financial system. I'll give it here. So to sum up our findings about E, E is a very noisy variable, and you should treat it as such. In using it in regressions, you should expect that E is going to have a very high standard error. And that if you can, you need to use instrumental variables estimation techniques due to the error in measurement. It probably has a very high error in measurement problem. An additional problem is that in analysis with companies or any sort of decision maker, if there's a case that E has been used as the decision variable, you have the additional problem of noise in the dependent variable, which can bias your coefficients. And there is no easy solution there other than avoiding linear regression techniques that I know of. And that's an interesting area for future research, if you ask me, and something I plan on looking into. What can be done about E? Well, we definitely need research on validity and reliability. That would be very difficult, of course, but it's an area that we desperately need research on in business and waste management and environmental studies. We need research on the validity of ESG measurements. What would make them more valid? We need to align them more with definitions of sustainability. I know that there are many definitions of sustainability, but it would be nice to align them more with definitions of sustainability rather than being aligned with definitions of risk management, in my opinion. There needs to be more research on the applicability of underlying variables and corporate performance. There has been a lot of research on whether E, S, and G are related to corporate performance, but not much research on the underlying variables in corporate performance. And I think that is really where the next stage of research needs to go, rather than relying on E, S, and G measurements. Of course, that's going to be much harder and a lot more work. And there needs to be much more research on underlying variables and ratings and how they affect each other. And there needs to be more research on ratings and the resulting environmental effects of companies, on how ratings and result in environmental change. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in regards to E. And we're still looking for an answer of what is a good measurement here. And we need a lot of answers. Well, thank you for your time. I hope you have found this informative. Thank you.